I stood before my own funeral, not because I had died, but because they wanted me erased clean and quiet. What they didn't know is I truly started living the moment I vanished. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, then you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch our next gripping episodes. Under the low gray belly of a Portland winter sky, the cold seemed to creep in not just through the windows, but through the very bones of the old house on Fremont Street. Snow hadn't fallen, not yet, but rain ticked on the roof with the insistence of a metronome, steady, intrusive, maddening. The kind of rain that didn't wash things clean, but left everything damp and heavier. In the dim-lit corner room of that house sat Lucille Harper, 79 years old, once a schoolteacher, once someone's lover, now just mom, or worse her, when her daughter spoke to her in clipped managerial tones. Lucille stared through the glass pane by her bedside, her breath misting the lower left corner. She leaned closer quietly so as not to attract attention. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket pulled over her lap, the same blanket her late husband had given her 40 years ago, though that story no longer mattered to anyone in this house. Outside, the black iron gate swayed slightly in the wind, and somewhere down the block a dog barked without pause, as if trying to dig its way into another dimension. Behind her a voice snapped. "Mom, the doctor said you're not supposed to be by the window this long. The cold affects your joints." Lucille didn't answer, didn't even turn her head. Her daughter Marianne was a nurse trained to speak in authority, to correct, to prescribe. Somehow that tone never turned off at home. Marianne crossed the room with a bowl of oatmeal in her hand, lips pressed tight like a vice. Her sneakers made soft scuffs on the hardwood floor as she approached. Lucille's stomach turned not at the food, but at the dull, automated way Marianne plopped the bowl on the nightstand. A metal spoon rattled against the rim. There was no eye contact, no smile, no warmth, just a task being completed. Another item checked off the morning list. "You didn't call Emma yesterday," Marianne said flatly, referring to Lucille's granddaughter. "She was waiting." Lucille said nothing. Marianne sighed. "You can't keep disappointing her, Mom. But since you clearly forgot again, I've taken your phone for now, until you're ready to take some initiative." Lucille's spine stiffened, but she didn't move. Her throat felt raw. The little white flip phone, worn at the hinges but still functional, had been resting on the arm of her recliner last night. She remembered. Marianne must have taken it after she'd gone to sleep. "David says you've been sneaking around the hallway at night," Marianne continued, brushing invisible dust from the windowsill. "He's concerned." David, the son-in-law. A man who had the emotional presence of a spreadsheet and the eyes of a man who only saw utility in people. Lucille didn't hate him. Hate required energy, and she had learned over the years to conserve. "He says maybe it's time we looked at full-time care. You forget too much. You leave the stove on. You get confused." Lucille blinked slowly. "I don't forget," she whispered. Marianne didn't seem to hear her. She was already walking out the door. "You need to eat something, and no more window time today, okay? You're just sitting here brooding. That's not healthy." The door clicked shut. Lucille stared at it for a long time. The oatmeal sat untouched, steaming faintly. The spoon quivered slightly from where Marianne had set it down, like it too had something to say. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. No footsteps returned. The house had settled into its familiar silence, broken only by the ever-present drizzle and the occasional creak of old wood reacting to the cold. Slowly, Lucille pulled her legs from under the blanket, her slippers touching the floor like feathers. She rose with caution, one hand gripping the nightstand to steady herself. The ache in her hip was persistent, but not enough to deter her. She shuffled to the hallway, casting a quick glance left and right. No sign of David. No creak of a chair. The TV wasn't on in the living room yet. He usually watched the market report around 9. That gave her at least 15 minutes. Lucille moved with quiet urgency to the end of the hallway. There, in the narrow antique hutch with the peeling oak veneer, was a drawer she had not opened in years. It stuck at first. She pulled harder, then gentler, then just enough. Inside, beneath a stack of tax papers and expired coupons, was what she was looking for. A folded map, Eugene, Oregon, 1986 edition. Her fingertips trembled as they traced the worn edges. The paper was yellowed, the creases deep, but it was all still readable. She unfolded it slowly, laying it on the hallway floor like a relic. Her eyes scanned instinctively. She didn't need the street names. She knew them by heart. 7th and Lincoln, that was where he had lived. Robert Allen. She hadn't spoken his name in years, not even aloud to herself. A man who once made her feel like the stars had choreographed their positions just to witness their meetings. They had been young, then married to other people, then older, then nothing. He had moved to Eugene. She had stayed behind. They wrote letters for a while, but life had a way of hardening sentiment into memory. Last she heard years ago, he had fallen ill. She had tried to reach out. No answer. She didn't know if he had passed. The internet was cruelly vague, but lately in her dreams she'd seen him again. Not sick, not gray, but youthful, barefoot, laughing on the porch of a house that never existed. She woke with tears she didn't understand. Something inside her whispered, "Go." She folded the map again, more carefully this time, and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan. She made her way back to her room and closed the door softly. From under her mattress she pulled out an old photograph. It was from 1962. She and Robert standing beside a rusted Chevrolet, mid-laugh, the wind catching her hair. His hand rested gently on her waist, but the intimacy was in the way they looked at each other, as though neither believed the moment was real. Her hands shook as she held it, as if her body knew what her heart refused to admit: she was running out of time. She placed the photo beside the oatmeal and turned again to the window. The rain had lessened to a mist. Streetlights blinked against the gray, their reflections smeared across puddles like paint on wet canvas. A crow landed on the fence, cawed once, then took off again, as though bearing a message she couldn't read. Lucille leaned her forehead against the glass. This house had windows, yes, but none that truly opened, none that offered a view that meant something. The walls were lined with family photos she had no say in displaying. Every corner felt borrowed, conditional. She was alive, but only technically. She closed her eyes, took a long, deliberate breath. Somewhere out there, Eugene waited, or maybe just the ghost of it. Either way, it was more alive than this, more real. Behind her, the oatmeal had grown cold. She didn't notice. Her hands rested on the windowsill, her knuckles pale, but her jaw set with quiet electric determination. The world might have forgotten who Lucille Harper was, but she hadn't, and she wasn't done. The house was quiet, too quiet. Lucille Harper had lived long enough to recognize the difference between peace and suppression. This silence was the kind that pressed against the ribs, the kind that only descended when the last light had gone out, and the people inside were certain the old woman in the guest room was no threat. But they were wrong. She hadn't been a threat before. Tonight, she would be. Rain whispered down the roof like secrets sliding off shingles. Lucille stood in the dark, fully dressed coat, zipped up her small suitcase beside her. It was one of those cheap, soft ones with wheels that didn't quite work unless the floor was perfectly smooth. But it would do. She had packed it slowly over the course of a week, one shirt at a time, a scarf here, a sweater there, toothbrush wrapped in tissue, socks rolled tight and stuffed into the corners. Everything she brought had to fit in one carry-on. The rest she left behind: photographs. Porcelain teacups she loved, a sweater Emma had knit with lopsided sleeves, her old journals. Even the music box Robert had given her in 1968 that still played Blue Moon, if you wound it just right, she had left it in the drawer beneath the bed. But she took the photo, the one of them on the hood of that rusted Chevrolet. She had placed it carefully between the pages of a slim black notebook and zipped it into the interior pocket of her coat. Her hand trembled as she bent over the dresser and wrote out a note. Just a few lines in her careful script. She knew they wouldn't understand, but she couldn't leave without saying something. "Marianne, I'm safe. Please don't worry. I needed to remember who I am before it's too late. This is not your fault. Mom, no accusations, no rage. She didn't have that kind of energy anymore. The note was folded and placed next to the oatmeal bowl from that morning, which still sat half full and untouched. She slipped down the hall in silence, each step rehearsed in her mind. Past the hallway light switch, past the family photo on the wall, one of those professional ones with matching outfits and forced smiles, past the coat rack where David's jacket still hung. At the front door she paused and looked back, not out of hesitation. It was more like standing at the edge of something vast, unsure if it would hold her weight or let her fall. But her hand was already on the doorknob. The rain was colder than she expected. She pulled her hood up, gritted her teeth, and wheeled the suitcase behind her. The wheels protested immediately against the uneven sidewalk. The house light stayed dark behind her. No one had seen. 3 blocks down, she reached the bus stop. It was nothing more than a plexiglass shelter with a flickering LED lamp overhead. The sign read, Line 9, Downtown Transit Center. From there, she'd transfer to the Midnight Greyhound to Eugene. She sat on the icy metal bench, breathing in the wet air, heart thudding like a young girl's. She was soaked within minutes, rain creeping down her collar, pooling at the edges of her sleeves, chilling her wrists. But she didn't move. She stared straight ahead, every nerve in her body tuned to the approaching sound of tires on wet asphalt. A car passed, then another, but no bus. Minutes dragged. Doubt slithered into the quiet of her resolve. She remembered the last time she ran. She was 32. She and Robert had met in secret, parked on a hill outside town radio, playing low while the sun died behind the mountains. He had asked her to leave everything. He had said, "Come with me, Lucille. I don't have much, but I have space for you. And I have time. That's more than most people can say." And she hadn't gone. She'd driven back home, told herself she couldn't hurt her children, couldn't disgrace her parents, couldn't rewrite a life that was already printed in ink. She stayed. Robert left. And even though she had lived a long, long life since then, married, widowed, held grandchildren in her arms, somehow it was that moment that had never stopped breathing in her chest. Headlights rounded the corner. She stood. The city bus groaned to a stop, hissing as it lowered for her. The driver, a bearded man in a rain-soaked cap, glanced up but said nothing. Lucille climbed aboard and tapped her fare card. The bus was empty. She sat by the window, her suitcase wedged awkwardly between her knees. The bus pulled away. Streetlights blurred against the rain-streaked glass. Lucille leaned her head against the window. The heat inside was too warm, clashing with the cold soaked into her skin. She didn't care. She was moving. That was enough. The route wound through the edges of Portland, past shuttered stores, neon signs buzzing through sheets of rain, the occasional figure darting under awnings. The city didn't sleep, not really. It only dimmed itself like an old woman ashamed of her wrinkles. At the downtown terminal, she switched buses. The Greyhound was late. She waited on a molded plastic seat beside a vending machine that blinked angrily and refused her dollar. Across from her, a man in a leather coat snored under a hoodie. A teenager with blue hair stared into her phone like it was a doorway to anywhere but here. Lucille sat still, clutching the strap of her suitcase, listening to the echo of her heartbeat between bus announcements. When the Greyhound pulled in at last, she boarded slowly with aching knees and steady hands. The bus smelled of coffee exhaust and something vaguely antiseptic. She settled into a seat by the window again. Habit. Always the window. She needed to see the road to believe she was actually leaving. The lights dimmed, the doors hissed shut. They rolled into the night. Outside the window, Portland receded its highways, its chain stores, its silhouettes of houses like hers, where other old women sat in rooms filled with things they couldn't take with them. Inside the bus, Lucille let her eyes drift shut. She was 20 again. She saw Robert at the train station, coat collar flipped against the wind, grinning like he had just won something impossible. She heard his voice in the back of her mind, half memory, half invention. "You always look like you're hiding a secret, Lucille. That's what I love. That spark you don't show anyone else. They had danced once in the kitchen of a rented cabin barefoot on tile, a record player skipping every third beat. The coffee had burned. The soup had boiled over. But they hadn't stopped dancing, even when the song ended, even when the moment was ridiculous. Especially then. And then the memory shifted. She was 43, sitting in a pew at her husband's funeral, her daughter beside her wiping dry tears, David standing like a statue at the end of the aisle. A dozen people said lovely things. No one mentioned the quiet, the forgetting, the small cruelties. She was 56, at Emma's 5th birthday. Someone handed her a slice of cake. No one asked her if she liked chocolate. 67, in a doctor's office. They spoke of blood pressure and calcium and thinning bones. They said fall risk and mental clarity like items on a menu. She wanted to scream, "I am not a symptom." Back in the present, the bus shuddered, a bump in the road. Lucille opened her eyes. The highway was empty, trees on either side. Darkness stretched infinitely ahead and behind. The world felt enormous and unknowable. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't expected: fear. Not the kind that made you run, but the kind that made you wonder. What if Robert wasn't there? What if he was gone? What if he didn't even remember her, or worse, had chosen to forget? What if Eugene was just another version of Portland, but colder? What if she had waited too long? Or maybe, just maybe, she hadn't waited at all. Maybe she had frozen. Maybe she had let herself be preserved in regret like a pressed flower between pages, beautiful and utterly dead. She looked down at her hands, old, veined, wrinkled like the map she carried, but strong enough, still hers. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and whispered, barely audible, "Is he still alive? Or is it just me?" Waiting to remember how it felt to be. The road answered with silence. But her heart, her stubborn, foolish, glorious heart, beat on. She was not running. She was returning. The bus hissed to a halt just outside Eugene. The sky was a tired gray, the kind that made morning feel like a continuation of night. Mist clung to the glass of the station windows, and fog swirled in the distance like the breath of something ancient and sleeping. Lucille Harper stepped off the bus, like a ghost entering the world of the living. Her knees ached from the hours of travel, her spine stiffened from sleep that had come in small, shallow sips. But she stood with a quiet strength suitcase in hand, eyes fixed on the streets ahead. Eugene had changed, or maybe it hadn't, and she had. Once this place had shimmered in her mind, golden afternoons, college bookstores, Robert's laugh echoing across the quad. She remembered trees that looked like stained glass in the fall cafes, with poetry taped to their windows, a kind of freedom that felt soft and perpetual. Now the streets were mostly empty, the buildings hunched like old men against the chill. The bus rumbled away behind her, leaving only silence and the steady rhythm of her breath. She walked, slowly, methodically. Her suitcase wheels bumped over cracks in the sidewalk, and she winced each time the bag caught on a curb or a piece of uneven pavement. She stopped occasionally, not from exhaustion, but to orient herself, to breathe, to remember. Her fingers, still damp from the mist, unfolded the wrinkled map she'd brought from Portland. She traced the street names with her eyes. So many of them were faded or gone, replaced by numbers or business zones. But she remembered. God, she remembered. 7th and Lincoln. That's where Robert had lived. A rented bungalow with a red door and a porch that creaked in the summer heat. She remembered standing on those wooden steps while he played guitar, the song clumsy but earnest, his voice cracking on purpose to make her laugh. Now the houses were different. Some boarded up, others converted into storage units or parking lots. The past had been scraped off these walls like old paint replaced by concrete and silence. She followed Lincoln Street 2 blocks north past a shuttered grocery store, then past what used to be a florist, now a vape shop. The corner she remembered as a coffee stand was a pawn shop with iron bars over its windows. But then finally the address she had memorized decades ago appeared in worn brass numbers above a gate. Her breath caught. It wasn't a house anymore. It was a building long, low, and institutional, its paint peeling in long, curling strips like dead bark. The sign out front was crooked one corner hanging by a single rusted screw. Evergreen View Care Center. But someone had taken a can of red spray paint and crossed out Evergreen, replacing it with a crude scrawl Nevergreen. The front windows were broken in places and covered in plastic sheeting. Vines had overtaken the sides. The place looked abandoned, like no one had entered or left in years. Lucille stood at the gate unmoving. She hadn't expected a miracle. She hadn't expected Robert to answer the door, grinning, asking what took her so long. But she had hoped for something, some trace of him, a mailbox with his name, a porch swing she might recognize, a damn silhouette behind a curtain. Instead, there was this derelict shell, this cemetery of care. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The tears had dried long ago, buried under decades of responsibilities, of apologies never sent. She simply stood there, fingers curled around the iron gate, staring at the building like it might blink and become real again. The wind picked up, cold, wet, a storm threatening to roll in from the west. She closed her eyes, fighting the sudden heaviness in her chest, and then a voice, soft, raspy, impossible. Lucille, she froze. The gate creaked behind her. Her breath stopped entirely. For a long, dizzy second, she wondered if she had imagined it, if her grief had conjured ghosts. Then she turned. There, under the awning of a bus shelter across the street, stood a woman in a long gray coat, her white hair pinned into a loose, trembling knot, a cane balanced against one knee, eyes that squinted against the mist but held a spark, a recognition. Lucille's voice came out broken. Mildred. The woman nodded slowly, and in an instant years collapsed. Mildred Wagner had once been everything Lucille needed when the world made no sense. Her roommate in college, her partner in sarcasm, the only person who knew about Robert, about the letters, about the decision Lucille had made, and regretted every day since. They had lost touch sometime in the late 90s. Life had done what it always did, swept them in different directions under the pretense of responsibility. But now she stood there, old, weathered, real. Lucille let go of the skate, her suitcase tipped over, forgotten. She walked across the street without looking for cars. They met under the bus shelter, two elderly women surrounded by a halo of falling mist. Neither said anything at first. They simply stared. Then Mildred opened her arms. It wasn't a dramatic hug. It wasn't fierce or movie perfect. It was slow, shaky, bones against bones. But it was whole. Lucille closed her eyes and leaned in. In that embrace, she remembered everything. The way Mildred used to hum Billie Holiday in the dorm room, the way they would sneak wine into paper coffee cups and sit on the library steps talking about things that made them angry. The first time Lucille had cried into her lap over Robert and Mildred, had held her like a sister, like someone who didn't need explanations. When they finally pulled back, the silence between them was thick and soft. The city around them had vanished. Mildred tilted her head, a half-smile forming on her wrinkled face. "You look like hell," she said. Lucille let out a dry laugh. "Better than the building across the street." Mildred nodded toward the broken-down facility. "That place hasn't had a patient in years. It used to be decent. Then the funding got cut. I think they tried to turn it into a rehab center, but it never took. Now it's just there." Lucille looked back at it. "Robert used to live there." Mildred was quiet. She reached out, took Lucille's hand. Her fingers were cold but steady. "I know," she said softly. "I used to visit him years ago." Lucille's knees nearly gave out. He was alive." Mildred gave her a look that was both kind and impossibly sad. "He was. For a time." Lucille's voice dropped to a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because by the time I knew how to find you again, it was already too late for him. And maybe I was afraid you wouldn't forgive me for vanishing." Lucille shook her head. "We both vanished." A pause stretched long between them. Then Mildred said, "Come with me." Lucille blinked. "Where?" "I have a place, not far. A little house in the woods, belonged to my aunt. Been mine for years now, though I haven't had anyone to share it with. It's quiet. It leaks when it rains. The raccoons try to steal the apples off the porch. But it's mine, and I'd like you to come." Lucille looked at her. Really looked. She saw the woman Mildred used to be, the same steel beneath the softness, the same warmth wrapped in wit. She saw someone who had never pitied her, never judged her. Someone who had once been a mirror and now might just be a way back to herself. She nodded, not out of desperation but out of clarity. The rain had picked up. It tapped on the metal roof of the shelter in uneven rhythm. Mildred lifted her cane. "Let's get out of here before we both rust." Lucille bent to pick up her suitcase. The wheels shrieked as they turned. The map inside her coat crinkled with every step. And just like that, the two of them walked away from the ruins of the past, toward something unknown, something fragile, something that against all odds might still be called home. They ducked under the torn canopy of the old bus shelter as the rain thickened into a steady downpour. Mildred pointed across the street with the tip of her cane toward the crumbling husk of the old care center. "We shouldn't stand here too long," she muttered. "There are squatters sometimes. The last thing I need is to get into a cane fight with a man half my age over a dry bench." Lucille managed a small smile. There was still humor in her friend, though it was laced with something heavier now. Bitterness, maybe? Or the kind of defiant resilience that comes after too many winters spent waiting for visitors who never come. They started walking, Mildred leading the way with short, sure steps. Her apartment wasn't far, just a few blocks tucked behind the university's forgotten rear lots. The sidewalk was broken in places with moss rising in the cracks. Streetlights flickered overhead. Rain hissed against the leaves, and the town looked as if it had been left behind by time, or maybe by intention. Inside the building, the hallway smelled of damp plaster and microwave dinners. Mildred's unit was on the second floor at the end of a long corridor stained with water damage and neglect. The key stuck in the lock, but with a grunt and a twist, the door creaked open. Lucille stepped inside and paused. The apartment was small, just one bedroom, a kitchenette, and a living space, but it was filled with life in a way her daughter's house never had been. Books lined the walls, mismatched mugs hung from hooks in the kitchen, and potted plants leaned out from the windowsill, as though reaching for something better. A quilt was thrown over a second-hand couch, and the room smelled faintly of mint tea and old paper. "I know," Mildred said as she pulled off her coat. "It's a dump, but it's mine." Lucille shook her head slowly. "It's warm." That single word carried more weight than it had any right to. Mildred gestured toward the table. "Sit. I'll make tea." Lucille sat, the old wood creaking beneath her. She watched as Mildred moved with careful familiarity, boiling water in a scratched kettle, pulling down 2 mugs from the shelf, dropping in bags of chamomile like it was a ceremony. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Robert," Mildred said after a long silence. "It wasn't out of cruelty. I just didn't know if it would hurt more to know or not know." Lucille looked down at her hands, now resting quietly on the tabletop. "You were probably right, knowing he was so close all those years." "You would have come," I would have, Lucille said, "and maybe ruined it." Mildred smiled as she set the tea before her. "Maybe, but maybe not." They drank in silence for a while, letting the steam fill the spaces that words could not. Outside, the rain showed no signs of stopping. Lucille reached into her coat and pulled out the photo. The edges were worn, the surface creased, but Robert's face still smiled up at her. That crooked grin, those eyes full of reckless tenderness. She set it gently on the table and turned it toward Mildred. "God, he loved you," Mildred said. "I know," Lucille replied, her voice breaking like glass under pressure. "And I loved him, but love wasn't enough." Mildred tapped the table lightly. "Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes timing is the cruelest piece of it all." Lucille closed her eyes. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd made just one different decision, only every single day?" Lucille opened her eyes again and met Mildred's gaze, and now Mildred looked down into her mug. "Now I think about how I want to spend what's left of it. I think about how tired I am of being forgotten, of being spoken to like a chore, of waiting in the same 4 walls for someone to remember I'm still breathing." Lucille nodded a slow, heavy agreement. "I wasn't living. I was maintaining, like a plant in a too small pot." "Exactly." Mildred leaned back in her chair. "Which is why I'm leaving." Lucille blinked. "Leaving." Mildred stood and walked to a bookshelf tucked into the corner. From behind a row of thick, dusty paperbacks, she pulled a small leather-bound folder. She laid it open on the table and turned it toward Lucille. Inside were photographs. A house. A small cabin really tucked between thick pines on a sloping hill. The porch sagged slightly. The roof was tin dulled by time. But the windows were big and open, and in one photo morning light spilled through them like gold. It was my aunt's, Mildred explained. In the Cascades, about 2 hours southeast. I used to go there every summer as a girl. After she passed, no one wanted it. Too remote, no plumbing in winter, no internet, just trees and quiet. Lucille studied the image like it was a secret map. It's beautiful. It's mine now. And I'm going back. I've been putting it off for years, thinking maybe I wasn't strong enough. But last week I saw myself in the mirror and I thought if not now, then never. Lucille smiled faintly. That's brave. No, it's selfish, Mildred said. And I'm finally okay with that. Another silence settled between them, comfortable this time. Then Mildred said, "Come with me." Lucille's breath caught. She looked up. "What?" "Come with me," Mildred repeated. "We can fix the roof together. Cook over a wood stove, sit on the porch and insult the birds. You take the front bedroom, sun comes through the east window like honey. I'll take the back one with the leaky corner." Lucille opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "I'm not offering charity," Mildred added. "I'm offering company, a pact. If the world won't make space for us, then we make our own." Lucille blinked rapidly. The image of her daughter's house came unbidden, its sterile walls, the impersonal smell of lemon cleaner, the way even the chairs made her feel unwelcome. The sounds of distant footsteps, the constant watching the way her name was spoken, more like a warning than an invitation. "I don't know if I'd be—" "Useful," Lucille finally said. "Useful," Mildred scoffed. "This isn't a job interview. This is a jailbreak." Lucille laughed, then a sharp, real thing that bounced off the kitchen walls and startled the potted fern by the window. "You mean it," she said. Mildred leaned forward, her eyes bright despite the storm outside. "Lucille Harper, you and I have spent enough of our lives being polite, enough being peripheral. If we're lucky, we have 10, maybe 15 more years. If we're really lucky, maybe 20. I don't know about you, but I'd like to spend those years somewhere I can wear pajamas all day and yell at trees without anyone judging me." Lucille was still laughing, tears slipping down her cheeks now. "You've always been insane." "Maybe, but I'm also right." There was something liberating in the absurdity of it all, in the idea that at their age they could still change the story, that it wasn't too late, that the last chapters didn't have to be written by someone else. Lucille wiped her eyes. Okay, I'll go." Mildred raised her mug. "To the ridiculous." Lucille clinked hers gently against it. "To the free." The next morning, while the city was still drowsy under a veil of low clouds, they packed. There wasn't much books. Warm clothes, a bag of tea, 2 ancient radios, and the photograph of Robert. Mildred wrote a short letter and left it taped to her apartment door. "Gone to find what's left of me," it said. No forwarding address. Lucille left no note. She didn't feel she owed one. By noon, they were on the road. Mildred's car was a beat-up Subaru with a dent in the side and a glove compartment that refused to close. But it started. It moved. That was enough. Eugene faded behind them like a dream as they drove toward the mountains, where no one would think to look for 2 women who had decided to live instead of wait. The road twisted upward, trees thickening on both sides, mist turning into sunlight that filtered through the canopy in shafts of gold. They didn't speak much during the drive. They didn't need to. Sometimes escape doesn't need a plan, just a yes. And in that small car, carrying everything they needed and nothing they didn't, 2 women crossed the threshold between survival and sovereignty. They didn't know what the cabin would look like now, didn't know if the roof still held. But they knew one thing: it would be theirs. The gravel road narrowed as the forest closed in. Pines lined both sides, towering, and still their dark green needles trembling only slightly in the cold wind that swept down from the hills. Lucille sat in the passenger seat, her hands in her lap, watching the trees pass like old memories, familiar but impossible to grasp. The old Subaru's tires crunched steadily beneath them, rising slowly toward something unseen, something that felt more like a beginning than an arrival. Mildred drove with quiet confidence, her thin fingers steady on the wheel. Neither woman spoke much. There was something sacred in the silence, something neither grief nor joy could interrupt. Occasionally, Lucille would catch Mildred glancing sideways, the faintest smirk at the corners of her lips, as if the entire situation was still slightly ridiculous and wonderfully dangerous. Then around one final bend, the forest opened like a curtain, and there it was. The cabin stood nestled between two enormous trees, their trunks gray and gnarled like ancient guardians. The roof was sloped a little crooked, the tin sheeting rusted in places and patched with mismatched shingles. The porch sagged on the left side, one post leaning like a drunk sailor. A stone chimney jutted from the side, and a single window frosted over from the cold caught a glint of the late afternoon sun. Lucille stared at it. I know, Mildred said, shifting the car into park. It's a dump. It's beautiful, Lucille whispered. They sat there a moment longer, letting the sight of it settle into their bones, like the first sip of warm tea after a long walk in the cold. Then Mildred opened her door and stepped out into the crisp air. Lucille followed, her legs stiff from the ride. Pine needles crunched underfoot. The air smelled of wet bark and wood smoke ghosts. A bird called from deep within the trees, low and uncertain. Mildred led the way up the front steps. They groaned under her weight. The door was weathered but sturdy, the wood rough beneath her palm as she turned the old brass knob. The interior was colder than outside. Dust hung in the still air like ash. Cobwebs danced in the corners. But the place had a shape, thick wooden beams across the ceiling, a stone hearth at the center of the room, and furniture covered in yellowed sheets that looked like shrouds waiting to be pulled back. Light streamed through the window, golden and soft, catching motes of dust that shimmered as they moved. Lucille stepped inside slowly, reverently. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in, the peeling wallpaper. The battered bookshelf filled with forgotten titles. The ceramic lamp missing its shade, the kettle still hanging over the old iron stove. I thought it would feel smaller, Mildred said, but it doesn't. It feels exactly right. Lucille nodded. It feels like somewhere people lived, and meant it. They spent the next few hours breathing life back into the space, opening windows, sweeping floors, pulling sheets off furniture. Each task came with a memory, a laugh, a grunt, a story. The couch revealed itself to be blue plaid. The chairs were wobbly but endearing. They found a box of old cassette tapes in the cupboard, alongside a pair of gardening gloves and a half-used can of wood polish that still smelled potent. Lucille discovered a small room at the back. Her room, Mildred declared. The bed frame was iron-rusted in places, but it held. The mattress sagged like a sigh. There was a window with no curtain and a wooden shelf built into the wall. She placed her suitcase at the foot of the bed, then the photo of Robert on the shelf. I think he'd like this place, she said aloud to no one in particular. By nightfall, they had cleared enough space to sit in the living room with mugs of instant coffee and the gas heater humming softly at their feet. The electricity was temperamental. Some outlets worked, others sparked in warning. But the little radio, after much fiddling and a slap to its side, came to life. Static, then a soft, familiar crackle, then music. Old, crackling, perfect. It was Etta James' Sunday kind of love. Lucille leaned back into the couch, her eyes closed, a smile slowly spreading across her face. I used to dance to this, she murmured, alone, when I was supposed to be folding laundry. Mildred chuckled. I once made out with a math professor to this song. He cried halfway through. They burst into laughter, the kind that only comes when pain and joy get twisted up inside you. That wild, gasping laughter that cleans something deep. Lucille leaned forward, wiping her eyes. God, I haven't laughed like that in decades. Yeah, well, Mildred said, standing with a dramatic grunt. Better get used to it. That's part of the rent. They settled into a rhythm over the next few days, clumsy at first, then fluid like muscle memory returning after a long sleep. Lucille took to mornings. She rose early, boiled water for tea on the stove, and sat on the porch, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the light shift through the trees. Birds came and went. Deer moved silently in the distance. The forest was never loud, but it was never truly still either. It whispered, breathed, pulsed. Mildred handled the firewood and the small radio, which she kept tuned to a station that played nothing newer than 1975. She had an old set of gardening tools and a tin box filled with seeds. Together they turned a patch of land behind the cabin into a crude garden bed: radishes, lettuce, herbs. Nothing fancy, just life springing from soil. The days were filled with laughter, chores, naps. The occasional argument about how to fix the back door hinge or whether the second drawer in the kitchen should hold cutlery or tea towels. They cooked simple meals: beans, rice, soup, thick with garlic. They read aloud to each other from battered novels, swapped stories of people they used to love and those they were glad to forget. One afternoon, Lucille tried to repair the broken antenna on the radio. She climbed onto a stool, screwdriver in hand, her mouth full of stubbornness. Mildred stood below, arms crossed. "You're going to fall and crack your hip. I'd rather die fixing this damn thing than listen to that static one more minute." "You say that now, but you'll change your mind halfway down." The antenna never quite worked, but somehow it didn't matter. The radio picked up just enough signal to play Nat King Cole as they danced barefoot in the kitchen. Two old women twirling slowly in a shaft of sunlight, like the last leaves of autumn. Lucille found herself smiling more often. Not the polite kind, not the forced kind she used around Marianne. These were full-body smiles, smiles that wrinkled her whole face and left her breathless. She had forgotten what that felt like. There were still moments of silence, of course. Nights when one of them would sit up late, staring into the embers of the fire, listening to wind brush against the cabin walls like lost souls asking to be let in. But even those moments were shared now. Known, understood, and in that understanding was something stronger than peace. It was freedom. Freedom to be unremarkable, to be inconvenient, to be soft, to be unfinished. On the seventh night, Lucille lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and realized something profound. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for permission, not for apology, not for a phone call that never came. She turned her head. The moonlight streamed through the window, pale and wide, like an invitation. Outside, the pines stood tall and silent. Inside, two women, bent but unbroken, slept under a roof that barely held, dreaming not of the past, but of the next sunrise. And for once that was enough. The first to notice was the mailman. On Monday morning, he slid a bundle of catalogs and utility bills into the Harper family's mailbox, just like he always did. But something felt off. The curtains in the front window, usually drawn back by 7:30, remained shut. No light peeked out from behind them. No movement. No dog barking. No flicker of a TV humming quietly from the living room. Just stillness. By noon, Marianne Harper realized her mother had not come out of her room. She stood outside the closed bedroom door, a mug of lukewarm coffee in her hand, her mouth dry with a sudden sharp unease. "Mom," she called. No answer. "Mom, are you still asleep?" She knocked. Silence. Her breath caught as she turned the knob. Inside the bed was Maid. The chair beside the window sat empty. The side table still held the uneaten oatmeal from the morning before, now crusted and gray. The closet door hung slightly open, and the small dresser drawer had been left ajar. Marianne's gaze swept the room, the panic crawling up her throat like a fever. She stepped to the center of the room, turned slowly, then froze. On the pillow placed with deliberate care was a folded note. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her mother's shaky, slanted cursive, the same script that had once written her permission slips, birthday cards, grocery lists. She opened it. "Marianne, I'm safe. Please don't worry. I needed to remember who I am before it's too late. This is not your fault. Mom." Her hand dropped to her side. The paper fluttered to the floor. For a few moments, Marianne didn't move. She stood there as if by sheer willpower she could summon her mother back into the room. That old woman, always so quiet, so passive, so manageable. How had she left? How had she managed it without anyone noticing? David found her like that a few minutes later, frozen pale, clutching nothing. "Where's Mom?" he asked. Marianne turned to him slowly, then collapsed into a chair and began dialing the police. The officers arrived within the hour. They asked routine questions. Was there a history of dementia? Number any suicidal tendencies? Number had Lucille ever disappeared before? Never. The note was collected and photographed. The room examined. The house photographed. They asked for recent photos. Marianne gave them one from Christmas, the only one she had on her phone. Lucille wasn't smiling in it. She sat stiffly beside the tree, her hands folded in her lap. The kind of smile you paste on when someone tells you to pose. Marianne's voice grew higher, thinner, as she explained her mother's medications, her lack of a driver's license, her arthritis, her supposed forgetfulness. She's not capable of going far on her own, Marianne insisted. She doesn't even have a bank account. She doesn't have friends anymore. This doesn't make any sense. The officer, a woman with calm eyes and a badge that read, Sergeant Delaney, glanced again at the note. Seems like she planned this, Delaney said. Do you know if she had any place she might want to go? Someone she might be trying to find? No, Marianne said too quickly. She's lived with us for 6 years. She doesn't know anyone anymore. Delaney didn't answer, but she scribbled something in her notebook. Within 24 hours, Lucille's face was on the local news. Missing 79-year-old woman vanishes from daughter's home in North Portland. They used the Christmas photo. Her expression haunted the screen more than her absence did. The media picked up the story faster than expected, perhaps because of the note, perhaps because of how few leads the police had to follow, or perhaps because there was something eerie about the idea of an elderly woman vanishing without a trace in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A reporter stood outside the house, her hair slicked by misting rain. Family members say Mrs. Harper was last seen Sunday night. She left no identification, no phone, and reportedly suffers from mild memory loss. The family is pleading with the public for any information. Marianne stood beside David during the broadcast. Her makeup was minimal, her mouth set in a hard line. She blinked rapidly. She wore a navy sweater, Lucille's favorite color. We just want her to come home, she said into the camera. We love her. We're worried sick. If anyone sees her, please, let someone know, please. She choked slightly on that last word, but her eyes remained dry. The neighbors began whispering. Officers canvassed the neighborhood. They went door to door. Did anyone see Lucille leave? Did anyone notice any unusual vehicles? A rideshare, a taxi, nothing. The house had no security cameras, and the neighbors' Ring doorbells were poorly positioned. The woman across the street, Diane, a retired teacher, told investigators she sometimes saw Lucille sitting by the window at odd hours. She always looked trapped, Diane said, like a bird behind glass. I waved once. She didn't wave back. They asked about family dynamics, whether there had been arguments, raised voices, conflict. Diane hesitated. They weren't unkind to her, just structured, like she had rules. I always got the feeling she wasn't allowed to be a person anymore, just someone's burden. Police checked local hospitals, bus stations, shelters. Nothing. By the end of the week, the case had stalled. No transactions, no phone activity, no camera footage from the bus station. Footage had already been recorded over. No reported sightings. Nothing except the note and the growing unease that Lucille Harper had done something unheard of. She had disappeared not by accident, but by choice. In the second televised interview, Marianne sat alone. David had declined. Her composure cracked this time. I don't know what she was thinking, she said, her voice wavering. She's fragile. She's not equipped to survive on her own. This isn't like her. The reporter leaned forward gently. Do you think she felt confined? Marianne blinked. No, we gave her a home, a safe place. We included her in everything. But there are reports she wasn't allowed to leave the house by herself. For her safety, Marianne snapped, then caught herself. I mean, she would forget things. She once left the stove on for hours. She left a note saying this wasn't anyone's fault. Marianne's face twitched. The camera zoomed in slightly. What would you say to her now if she's watching? Marianne paused. The silence stretched. Then softly, we love you. Please come home. But her eyes told another story. Not grief, not guilt. Something more complicated, something closer to being exposed. Sergeant Delaney reviewed the footage that night in her car. She had watched a lot of interviews over the years, people pleading for lost children, spouses, siblings. She knew the signs of lying, of guilt, of panic. Marianne Harper didn't fit any mold. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't mourning either. Delaney sipped her coffee and replayed the clip again. That note, the phrasing of it. I needed to remember who I am before it's too late. People don't write things like that before committing suicide. They write things like that before escaping. Delaney typed a note in her case file. Not convinced this is a typical missing persons case. No signs of foul play. Possible intentional disappearance. Subject may be cognitively sharp, possibly seeking independence. She closed her laptop. It wasn't over. Not yet. Marianne lay awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. She had replayed every moment from the last week 1,000 times. When had Lucille planned it? When had she packed? How had she gotten past them? Past the cameras at the store? Past the world? There was one possibility that haunted her. That Lucille had been pretending, waiting, watching slowly, gathering the courage in pieces of her escape, like a prisoner counting the seconds between guard rotations. Marianne rolled over and pulled Lucille's old sweater off the nightstand. It still smelled faintly of lavender. She pressed it to her face, not because she missed her mother, but because she wanted to understand. The worst part wasn't that Lucille had left. The worst part was that she hadn't told Marianne where she was going. Hadn't even trusted her with the truth. 3 weeks later, the flyers were still taped to stop signs and cafe doors. The Facebook group, Find Lucille Harper, had 314 members. People shared stories, speculations, theories. One woman said she saw her near the Columbia River. Another claimed she saw someone matching her description in a thrift store in Salem. All leads went nowhere. But a strange shift began to take place. People started talking not just about Lucille, but about their own mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers, the women in their lives who had grown quiet and small as they aged, the ones whose voices had been turned down like background noise. Someone posted, "What if she didn't get lost? What if she got free?" The post went viral. Somewhere in the woods, far from cameras, microphones, and the weight of assumptions, Lucille Harper sat by a fire with a book in her lap and a mug of tea warming her hands. The wind whispered in the trees above her, and laughter drifted from the kitchen where Mildred cursed at a burned potato. Lucille smiled. She wasn't missing. She had simply arrived. The fire was low, casting a warm orange pulse against the cabin walls. Snow brushed gently against the windows, a soft hush on the world outside. The cabin smelled of pine-wood old books and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon, or maybe just the memory of it. Lucille sat in a worn armchair wrapped in a faded quilt, legs curled beneath her. Across from her, Mildred sat with her feet resting on a stool, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Between them on the mantel, the old radio crackled with static before catching signal. No confirmed sightings in over 4 weeks. Police continue to urge the public to report any information. Family remains hopeful. It was her name again. Lucille Harper, spoken into the airwaves like a ghost still expected to come home. They always used that same photo, her unsmiling face beside a Christmas tree, her hands folded like a patient in a waiting room. They never used photos from before. Photos where she laughed or ran or danced barefoot in a kitchen. Mildred reached over and turned the knob until the voice faded into a low, distant hum. They didn't need to hear it anymore. The script never changed. The silence that followed was heavier than usual. Not oppressive, just present. It lived in the room with them, sat with them by the fire like a third companion. Lucille stared into the flames, eyes unfocused. "For the first time in my life," she said quietly, "I feel like I am truly myself." Mildred didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Some truths didn't require applause. She just nodded, a slow, reverent movement like one witness acknowledging another. "I don't think I've ever heard you say anything like that before," Mildred finally said. Lucille smiled faintly. "I don't think I ever knew how." They sipped their tea in silence. Outside, the snow thickened. The next morning, the forest was buried in white. The trees stood like frozen sentinels, and the sky was a pale blur of nothingness. The world felt paused. hushed, sacred. Mildred stood at the front door in her robe and boots, a scarf around her neck. She held something in her hand wrapped in a dish towel, square and heavy. Lucille stepped beside her and raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Mildred unwrapped it slowly, revealing a dusty old Polaroid camera. "Found it in the pantry under the old flour tins. I think it still works." Lucille laughed. "You want to document our fugitive lifestyle?" "I want proof," Mildred said, "that we were here, that we mattered, that we weren't just lost." They took their first photo standing on the porch, squinting into the weak sunlight. Both of them bundled in layers, Lucille in an oversized knit sweater, Mildred in her threadbare coat with a rip under the arm. The camera gave a satisfying whir, then spat out the photo with a wheeze. They watched it develop slowly, the colors bleeding into shape like memory rediscovering itself. It was grainy, crooked. Lucille's face was half in shadow, and Mildred's hair was doing something wild in the wind. It was perfect. They taped it to the wall above the wood stove. Beneath it, Mildred scribbled, "Day 1 still here." From then on, they photographed everything. Lucille hanging her damp coat on a rusted nail. Mildred peeling potatoes with a butter knife. A kettle whistling. 2 bowls of soup on the windowsill. Their boots lined up by the door. A raven perched on the porch railing, staring in like it knew something they didn't. None of the photos were artistic, but that wasn't the point. They weren't posing for anyone. They were proving to themselves day by day that they were real, present, seen if only by each other. Lucille started writing again too. Not letters, not lists, just thoughts. She wrote them on scraps of paper on the back of grocery receipts they'd brought from the city, even on the edges of old newspaper sheets they used for kindling. "We are not missing. We are remembered by the wind. Today we chopped firewood, and I didn't cry once. I usually cry doing things that remind me of being useful. There was a time I thought I'd die in silence. Now I think I might die laughing." Mildred read them sometimes without asking. Lucille didn't mind. They were co-authors in this rebellion. It was on a Sunday when Lucille brought out the tin box. She didn't say anything at first. She just placed it on the kitchen table with a soft thud. It was dented at the corners, the paint chipped and rusted. Mildred looked at her. "Is that what I think it is?" Lucille nodded. Inside was her old driver's license, her Medicare card, a folded Social Security statement, 2 photos of Emma when she was younger, and a phone-battered, cracked battery long dead. Her identity, everything the world used to call her by. Mildred disappeared for a moment and came back with her own wallet. Together, they emptied the box, laying their old names, numbers, and documentation on the table. Like evidence in a trial they were no longer attending. Lucille touched the phone once more, then slipped it into the box again. "Let's bury it," she said. They picked a spot beneath a tall cedar just outside the clearing. The ground was stiff, but not frozen. Lucille dug. Mildred stood watching her hands in her coat pockets, face turned to the trees. When the hole was ready, Lucille placed the tin box inside slowly, deliberately. Then she added the old flip phone, a bus schedule folded in half, and her birth certificate. Mildred dropped in her expired passport and a ring she hadn't worn in 15 years. They covered the hole with pine needles. Then they stood there for a long while, neither of them speaking. The silence was not solemn. It was proud. They hadn't buried themselves. They had buried the fiction, the one the world had insisted they keep playing. Back inside, they sat by the fire again. Mildred turned the radio on low. The announcer was still listing updates, still speaking Lucille's name like it was a question mark. Believed to be vulnerable, possibly confused. Family expresses concern. Lucille took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "I've never felt less confused in my entire life." Mildred raised her mug. To clarity. Lucille clinked hers against it. To being untraceable. They laughed. The sound filled the room. That night, Lucille taped another photo above the stove. It was of their feet resting on the porch railing, boots, dusty mugs steaming beside them. The edge of the forest just visible in the frame. She wrote underneath, "Not missing, just finally not asking for permission." Then she turned out the lights, and the only thing left glowing in the dark cabin was the fire, and 2 women, unnamed, unclaimed, and entirely unapologetically alive. The church smelled of lilies and silence, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but staged, deliberate. as if every person sitting in the pews was rehearsing their sadness, trying to decide when and how to express it. The candles burned low at the altar, their flames steady despite the shifting wind outside. There was no casket, only a framed photo. Lucille Harper, 79 years old, missing and presumed deceased. Her image sat atop a small table dressed in white cloth, surrounded by flowers and faded memories. They'd chosen an old picture one from before her arthritis bent her fingers and before her eyes lost that steel. She looked younger, softer. Marianne had insisted on that photo. She would have wanted to be remembered that way, she told the pastor. But the truth was, Marianne wasn't sure what her mother would have wanted anymore. It had been a year, 365 days without a trace. No sightings, no transactions, no confirmed leads, just the note, just the emptiness she left behind. The authorities had closed the file 2 months earlier, presumed deceased by choice or circumstance. That was how they phrased it. Marianne had stared at those words on the report, feeling something inside her shift. Not break, just loosen. David sat beside her, now silent in his suit. His phone was off for once. On the other side of the aisle, a few neighbors, some distant cousins, and Emma, now grown enough to wear mascara, fidgeted quietly. The pastor's voice floated above them all, delivering kind but generic eulogies. She was a woman of quiet dignity, who dedicated her life to family, who lived simply and loved fiercely. Marianne looked down at her lap where her hands rested stiffly holding the funeral program. A single lily printed on the cover. Beneath it, in loving memory of Lucille Marie Harper. The words didn't feel real, because there was no body, because there had been no goodbye, because somewhere deep inside Marianne wasn't sure her mother was gone at all. 200 miles away in the clearing, nestled between old pines and melting snow, Lucille stood barefoot in the damp grass, planting daffodil bulbs beside the porch steps. Her hands were muddy, her knees wet through her jeans, and her cheeks flushed from the work. Spring had arrived. The mountain air had softened, the trees budded cautiously. Robins returned to the branches like old friends, and the snow at long last had surrendered to sun. From inside the cabin, the sound of harmonica drifted out soft and clumsy. Mildred was playing again, even though she never got the notes right. She insisted she was getting better. Lucille laughed every time she said it. They had spent the entire winter in layers of wool and flannel, hauling firewood and taking turns keeping the stove lit. But now with the thaw came color. They opened the windows, washed the quilts, read poems out loud in the sun. Lucille's journal had grown thick. Photographs lined the cabin walls like pages from a private gospel. 2 old women fixing a leaky roof. One blurry photo of a squirrel stealing toast, another of their boots drying near the fire. Lucille wiped her hands on her jeans and stood breathing in the scent of thawing earth. Then she walked inside. The letter had taken her weeks to write. She kept it hidden in the drawer beside her bed, folded into thirds, sealed in a plain white envelope. No return address, no name on the front, just Marianne written in her mother's careful hand. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't an apology. It was something closer to a permission slip. That evening, Lucille sat at the table by the window, the envelope in her hand. Outside, the last light of day turned the forest gold. Mildred set a plate down beside her bread beans, a sliver of cheese. "You're sure?" she asked. Lucille nodded. "She needs it more than I do." Mildred sat slowly. "You really think this will help her let go?" Lucille didn't answer right away. She turned the envelope over in her hands. "I think if I had received something like this from my mother, I might have understood her better, even if it hurt." She looked out the window. "I don't want to be a ghost that haunts her. I want to be the fire that tells her to stop waiting." The next day, Mildred made the trip down to town. She mailed the letter herself from a small box outside the co-op store. No cameras, no witnesses. 3 days later, it arrived at Marianne's house in Portland. She stood frozen at the mailbox, staring at the envelope. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her breath caught. Her knees softened. She looked over her shoulder, nothing but her driveway, the house, the quiet street. Inside, she sat at this kitchen table and opened it with shaking hands. "My dearest Marianne, if you are reading this, then I have decided to truly disappear. Not in anger, not in fear, but in peace. Please don't look for me. Please don't mourn me. I am not gone in the way you think I am. I am simply elsewhere where I can breathe and move and remember who I used to be before I became someone's responsibility. You were not a bad daughter, but you were a busy one. You wanted control more than you wanted connection. I understand. I really do. That's what the world taught you. It taught me too. But here's what I never said out loud. I was lonely in your house. I was invisible. I stopped laughing. I stopped singing. I stopped being real. And one day I realized that if I didn't leave, I would fade entirely. So I left. I am safe. I am not afraid. I have company. And most importantly, I have chosen this, not as a protest, but as a gift to myself, something no one else could give me. You do not need to forgive me. You do not need to understand. You only need to let go. You will be okay. You're stronger than you think. But please don't wait for a call that won't come. Don't let guilt rot the life you still have left to live. I will love you always, but I'm no longer waiting to be loved back. Goodbye, Mom. Marianne sat at the table long after the letter dropped from her hands. The house was quiet, sterile still. She didn't cry at first. She didn't move. The truth didn't hit her like a truck. It was worse. It slid into her slowly like ice melting into the cracks of her skin. Her mother wasn't lost. She had been left behind, and she'd chosen to stay that way. That night, Marianne stood in the doorway of Lucille's old room. It had remained untouched for over a year. The books still lined the shelves. The wool scarf still hung on the doorknob. The folded blanket sat on the bed, clean, unused, undisturbed. She walked to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and found a small wooden box inside. Inside were old photos, a music box, a note she hadn't seen before, written years ago. It said simply, "Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is walk away." Marianne closed the drawer, slowly. For the first time she understood what her mother had done. Not abandonment, not cruelty, but reclamation. And in a strange, sharp way it made her proud. Far away in the clearing of pine trees and wild daffodils, Lucille sat on the porch with Mildred watching the sun set. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They simply watched the light fall across the world they had made for themselves, quiet, honest, and wholly their own. And for the first time since childhood, Lucille felt whole. The mountain trail curved sharply as the young man hiked higher, his boots crunching over fallen needles and wet leaves. The late afternoon sun filtered through golden canopies, casting patches of honeyed light on the forest floor. A gust of wind lifted the edge of his wool scarf, and he paused to take a long breath. Camera slung against his chest, fingers tingling from the chill. Elliot Monroe was 27, a part-time barista, and a full-time dreamer. He'd been hiking solo since dawn, chasing light through the Cascades for his personal photo series Quiet. No portraits, no cities, just places where the world seemed to forget itself and return to something elemental. He had already filled half his roll mist weaving between pines, a stag outlined against a rocky ridge, frost clinging to the mouth of a cave. It was good work, but not alive. As he reached the ridge, the forest thinned, and through a break in the trees, he spotted something unexpected. A house, small wooden with a rusted metal roof. Smoke curled from a narrow chimney. A porch wrapped around the front framed in tangled ivy. Time had softened the edges of the place. It looked like a memory built into the mountain itself. Elliot crouched, raising his camera. He framed the cabin. The light was perfect, warm, and falling fast. Then something shifted in the window. He adjusted the lens. Two women sat side by side behind the glass, backlit by the golden wash of sunset. They were old, 80, maybe more. One wore a patterned shawl and rested her head on the other's shoulder. The second woman held a steaming mug between both hands. Their faces were turned toward one another mid-laughter, and though he couldn't hear them, he could feel the warmth in it, the ease, the truth. They looked like they had belonged there forever. Elliot's breath caught. He lowered the camera, then hesitated, raised it again. He had captured waterfalls and moose and mountain peaks, but never this. He moved quietly around the clearing, careful not to be seen, but the creak of a branch betrayed him. The woman with the mug turned her head toward the window. Her gaze found his instantly. He froze halfway behind a pine trunk caught like a boy stealing apples. She blinked, then smiled. A moment later, the other woman joined her at the window. They whispered something to each other, then disappeared from sight. Elliot backed away, flustered, adjusting his camera strap and preparing to leave. But then he heard the door open. The woman in the shawl stepped out onto the porch. She leaned on a cane but stood tall. Her face was lined deeply, her gray hair pulled into a loose braid. Her eyes, however, were sharp. "You might as well come out," she called. "You're terrible at hiding." Elliot stepped cautiously into the open. I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I was just hiking. I didn't realize there was a home up here." The second woman appeared in the doorway. Her cheeks were flushed from the fire inside. She looked more reserved than her companion, but she gave a small, polite nod. "We don't get many visitors," she said. "I'm a photographer," Elliot explained quickly. "I wasn't trying to spy. I just saw the moment. You light the window. It was beautiful," the first woman offered, amused. Elliot nodded sheepish. "Yes, very." There was a long pause. Then the woman shrugged. "Well, you saw us. Might as well make it worth your time. Take the picture properly." Elliot blinked. "Really?" She nodded toward the porch swing. "Give us 5 minutes. We'll sit for you." The other woman didn't argue. She simply stepped back inside with a look that said, "Why not?" Elliot stood stunned. "Thank you," he said, as if they were granting him a final gift. They sat together in the fading light, arms resting gently on their laps. The shadows of the porch slats striped across their knees. The forest stretched endlessly behind them, the sky beginning to blush with twilight. Elliot adjusted the lens, framed, focused, and clicked. One shot, then another. But it was the third frame that caught it. They had turned to look at one another. Not posed, not smiling for the camera. Just being. That exact second, Lucille's eyes catching Mildred's. Mildred's hand gently brushing a strand of hair from Lucille's forehead. In the background, the glow of the cabin window. In the foreground, everything they hadn't said, but had lived. Elliot exhaled slowly, lowering the camera. "Thank you," he said again. "You're welcome," Lucille replied. "But don't publish it. Not unless you're certain the world needs it." He nodded. "I won't use your names." "That's good," Mildred said, standing slowly. "Because we left them behind a long time ago." 3 months later, the photo won the National Independent Photography Award. The contest theme had been unspoken. Hundreds of submissions from across the country, dancers in motion, fathers hugging sons, grief etched into candlelit vigils. But none of them carried the weight of Elliot's image. He titled it "Radiant in Exile." Judges described it as haunting, intimate, eternal. The image ran on the front page of 3 major art publications. It flooded photography blogs. It was printed in black and white, and then in color. Critics debated whether it was staged. Who were these women? Where was this cabin? Were they sisters, lovers, survivors? Someone online suggested they might be nuns. Another claimed it was a publicity stunt. But the truth, no one knew. Elliot refused to reveal the location. "They asked me not to," he said simply. When asked why the image had moved so many, he only replied, "Because they weren't performing. They were living. And most of us don't know the difference anymore." Marianne saw the photo 3 weeks after it was published. She was standing in line at the grocery store when a magazine caught her eye. At first, she only saw the setting wood mountain's dusk. Then she saw the faces. Her throat closed. She bought 3 copies, went home, stared at it for hours. She knew it was her mother. She also knew she would never find that place, and that if she did, it wouldn't matter. Lucille had already chosen to disappear, and in that photo she looked more alive than Marianne had ever seen her, more real than she had ever let herself be. She placed 1 copy in a drawer beside the bed. The other she framed, and the third she mailed without a note, without a name, to Emma. Back in the woods, the cabin remained quiet. No reporters came. No drones circled overhead. Lucille and Mildred knew the photo had escaped into the world. Elliot had sent them a print along with a short letter. "I called it Radiant in Exile because I believe you were exactly that. Thank you for letting me see." They pinned it beside the others. A life recorded not for others, but for themselves. Lucille touched the edge of the photo gently, then turned back toward the porch where Mildred was already pouring tea and the sun was about to sink below the trees. Neither of them ever said another word about the picture. Because they didn't need to. The world had seen them finally, but only on their terms. The cold returned like a familiar ache. It crept in, not with storms, but with silence. The kind of silence that pressed against the windows and sank into the wood of the old cabin. Outside, the forest dimmed to gray. Snow clung to the tips of pine branches. The air turned brittle. Firewood was stacked higher than ever on the porch, and Lucille began waking earlier, stoking the stove, before the frost could take hold of the floorboards. Mildred moved slower now. Her breath came shorter, sometimes catching in her chest like a broken zipper. The cough had started weeks earlier, dry and subtle, easily ignored. But now it rattled her bones when she laughed, lingered when she spoke, and haunted the corners of the room even when she wasn't in it. Lucille noticed her friend sitting more often, her fingers trembling a little when she reached for the teapot, her voice thinner in the evenings. She tried not to say anything at first. Mildred was proud, fierce even in her fragility, but there was no denying what was happening. One morning, while Lucille was chopping carrots for soup, she heard a crash from the bedroom. She dropped the knife and ran. Mildred lay on the floor beside the bed, her eyes open, her hand clutched around the edge of the nightstand. Her face was pale, her lips dry. She looked up at Lucille, not with fear, but with quiet apology. Lucille knelt beside her. "You stubborn old crow," she whispered, brushing the hair from Mildred's forehead. "I tripped," Mildred murmured. "The floorboards are attacking me." They both laughed, but there was no weight to it. Lucille helped her up, sat her on the edge of the bed, and made her drink water. That night she added a second log to the stove and sat beside Mildred until she fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of her chest beneath the quilt. Winter pressed harder as the weeks passed. Lucille became caretaker without ceremony. She brewed tea with honey and thyme. She tucked heating pads under Mildred's knees. She rubbed ointment into her back during the worst nights, and every morning she checked the color in her cheeks before she lit the stove. Mildred resisted at first, complained about being babied, about being treated like some invalid, but Lucille never patronized her. She moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had watched others fade and knew the cost of pretending. They spent most afternoons in the living room, layered in quilts, the radio humming softly in the background. The old antenna worked better now. Lucille had climbed onto the roof and adjusted it by hand one icy morning, ignoring Mildred's shouts from below. Some days Mildred still played the harmonica. Other days she just held it, fingers resting on the cool metal like memory. They talked more now than ever before, not about the present, not about the weather, but about the lives they left behind. "Do you ever think about what you missed?" Lucille asked one afternoon, her voice low. Mildred didn't answer immediately. "Then not as much as I used to." Lucille waited. Mildred closed her eyes. "I think about my mother sometimes. The way she folded towels. How she always smelled like baking powder and cigarettes. I think about the girl I almost married. How I let her go because I was afraid. Of the church. Of my brothers. Of what people would say." Lucille nodded. "And now I know none of them would have remembered. Anyway," Mildred said with a dry smile, "the people who controlled me, most of them are dead, and I'm still here. Isn't that funny?" Lucille looked out the window. "I think about Robert," she said, "about how I let him go because I thought I was being good. A good mother, a good wife, a good woman. Turns out I was just scared." Mildred placed a hand on hers. "You were trying to survive." Lucille squeezed her fingers. "And now," Mildred whispered, "we're finally living." One evening, as snow fell in slow spirals, they sat close to the fire, the room glowing orange and gold. The radio played faintly, an old jazz record crackling through the static. Lucille poured tea into chipped mugs. Her hands were steady. She felt strong, not despite her age, but because of it. She had walked through decades of silence, and now every word she spoke tasted like something she'd earned. Mildred held the mug close to her chest, breathing in the steam. She looked out the window for a long time before speaking. "If I'd known freedom could be this simple," she said, "I would have left a long time ago." Lucille didn't respond. Mildred turned her head. "I mean it." Lucille met her gaze. "You did leave. You just had to take the long way." Mildred smiled. Her eyes were watery, but not from the cold. So did you. Outside the trees swayed, the sky darkened. Somewhere in the forest an owl called. Inside, two women sat in the last light of day, wrapped in warmth, not just from the fire, but from each other, from the knowing that they had rewritten the endings the world had tried to write for them. They said nothing else that evening. They didn't need to. The music played softly, a trumpet, a low hum of piano keys. And for that moment there was no pain, no regret, no weight of lost time. Only the sound of wind brushing against the cabin walls, the tea cooling on the table, and two lives finally lived fully, freely, and without permission. Lucille sat long after Mildred had fallen asleep watching the fire. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who obeyed, who folded herself small, who waited for someone else to give her permission to breathe. That girl was gone now. In her place was a woman who had sat beside death and chosen to laugh anyway. A woman who knew that freedom didn't have to look loud or fast or public. Sometimes freedom looked like two mugs, a blanket, a song, and a window to the snow. And for the first time in her life, Lucille didn't need more than that. The fire had long since burned down to a quiet red glow. A soft snow had begun to fall again, brushing against the windows like fingers on an old page. The wind whispered through the pines, not sharp this time, but hushed, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Lucille sat in her chair beside the small wooden bed, her hands resting on her knees, unmoving. Mildred lay beneath the quilt they'd stitched together last spring, scraps of old shirts, pieces of forgotten curtains, the corner of a dish towel with a cat embroidered in fading thread. Her face was peaceful, tilted slightly toward the window. One hand rested on her stomach, the other curled gently around the edge of the blanket. Her mouth still carried the curve of a smile. Lucille knew. She had known when she woke before dawn, when she no longer heard the wheezing breath that had filled their nights for the past month. She had known when she reached out to touch her hand and felt a stillness that wasn't sleep. She had known, and yet she hadn't cried. Not yet. Instead, she had lit the fire again, swept the floor, boiled water for tea. She'd sat beside Mildred for hours, sometimes whispering, sometimes just breathing. Now she leaned forward, brushing a strand of silver hair from Mildred's temple. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly breaking. "Thank you for giving me a chance to live, not just survive." The words hung in the air, warm and unhurried. Lucille closed her eyes. She buried her friend beneath the tall cedar where they had buried their old names. It took her all day to dig the ground, her joints screaming, her breath coming in fits. But she did it, slowly, with dignity, with the rhythm of someone who had nothing left to prove, only something to finish. She wrapped Mildred in the quilt, folded it tight as if she were tucking her in for one last nap. She placed the harmonica beneath her friend's folded hands, pressed a small photo between them, a picture they had taken the day the daffodils bloomed. And then she said goodbye. No hymns, no prayers, just silence and the sound of the forest watching. When the last bit of soil was smoothed over, Lucille sat beside the grave with a mug of tea and the old radio on her lap. She turned the dial until it caught something, a low melody, a trumpet drifting through static. She smiled. The seasons moved without ceremony. Snow gave way to mud. Mud gave way to blossoms. Lucille continued the life they had built. She tended the small garden. She replaced the worn shingles on the roof. She read aloud to herself in the evenings. She played the harmonica now and then, badly, but with spirit. Sometimes she danced barefoot on the porch when the weather was kind. Sometimes she spoke to Mildred, and sometimes she didn't need to. Time began to stretch and blur. The years folded into each other like pages in a book she no longer needed to finish. She kept a notebook beside her bed, jotting down dreams, thoughts, moments she didn't want to forget. Most of them started with "remember when." She never went back down the mountain. No one came looking anymore. The world forgot, as it always does. Except once. A journalist from Eugene wrote a piece for a small magazine 5 years after the photo went viral. It was about the mystery women of the Ridge. The article dissected the photograph again, offered theories, tracked every known cabin within a 200-mile radius. It referenced Elliot Monroe's last interview, his refusal to name them, his insistence on protecting their choice. It ended with a sentence that lingered. "Maybe some people don't disappear to be found. Maybe they disappear to be free. A few online threads reignited. Names were guessed. Speculation flared briefly, then died. But no one ever found Lucille. Not truly. And then one day she was gone. There was no dramatic ending, no storm, no collapse, just absence. A neighbor hiking through the forest years later found the cabin empty. There were 2 mugs on the table. The quilts were folded. The firewood was stacked. A journal lay open on the bed. On the final page in Lucille's handwriting were the words, "I lived, finally." The final image of the film is quiet. A single window, the same one from the famous photograph. Light spills through it golden warm. Dust dances in the air. On the windowsill sits the old radio, its dials worn smooth by years of use. Next to it a faded Polaroid, the one that captured 2 women laughing side by side with the mountain behind them. There are no people in the frame, only the echo of their lives. And then faintly somewhere from within the woods, laughter, not young, not forced, but full, real, and free. Fade to black.